Hi everyone, I hope you're having a beautiful day. In the last episode, we watched James's first gentle Noel with Lie to Diep and Little Nye. One small string of lights, a paper star, and simple thank you cards that quietly warmed their home. Today, we'll see how, under that same soft glow, James finally opens his heart to Diep, and they sit over a simple breakfast to ask, can this little kitchen table become their future together? If this warm, emotional story touches you, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. By the time James finally says, Diep, could we take a little walk? His heart is beating louder than the fridge and the radio put together. Louder even than the memory of "You are not my son" that still sometimes echoes in his chest at night. And for a moment, he's afraid she'll look at him with that tired, polite smile people wear when they just don't have room for someone else's feelings. But instead, Lie to Diep, this single girl raised by a single mom who taught her to read letters and patch clothes and keep going, just glances toward the window where the new Noel lights glow and nods. Like going out into the soft evening with him is the most natural thing in the world. Nye senses it instantly. Children who've lived through sharp moments learn to feel the change in the air before adults even name it. And she pauses with a stack of handmade cards in her hands. I'll stay with the lights, she says in that wise little voice of hers. I still have to line up the cards and put the nicest ones on top. You two go look at the star. She doesn't wink, but the knowing tilt of her head might as well be a blessing. James reaches for the key on the hook. His hand finds it now without that old flinch, and he opens the door with the quiet competence of someone who has been taking out the trash, fixing the sink, and folding the laundry long enough to feel the rhythm of this household in his bones. The hallway is dim but friendly. Someone on the second floor has propped their door a crack to let the smell of simmering broth drift out, and the stairway light they helped authorize last week glows steadily, their names still on the work order tucked inside the room rent folder back on the table. As they walk down the stairs, side by side, there is no grand music, only the sound of their steps and the distant bark of a dog out in the alley. And he thinks that if he had to pick a soundtrack for this moment, it wouldn't be the big romantic songs of his youth, but the small sounds of a building settling, a kettle whistling 2 floors up, a neighbor coughing, someone closing a window against the chill. Outside, the world feels like a different room of the same house. The air is cool, and above them, the tiny paper star in their window is just visible, a pale little badge against the night. The short string of lights is mostly hidden from this angle, but he knows it's there, wrapping itself around the spice shelf and the calendar where they've written clinic dates and school meetings. And that knowledge makes him feel like there's a thread connecting this sidewalk to that kitchen, and that kitchen to his chest. They walk toward the corner of the building where the street lamp throws a gentle circle of light, saying little at first. It's a calm silence, not the heavy kind he used to carry around his father, counting every breath. You've been quieter today, Diep observes after a while, not accusing, just noticing. A different kind of quiet than the first days. He nods, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The first quiet was shock, he admits. Like someone had slammed a door, and my ears hadn't caught up yet. Today's quiet feels more like listening. To the floorboards, the kettle, the way you and Nee breathe when you're focused on something. I'm learning the sounds of this life. I didn't want to talk over them. She smiles at that. And any woman who has spent years being talked over might feel a bit of the same warmth she does now. Listening is a good start, she says. Especially in a small home, sound travels faster than apologies. They both laugh softly, and the shared humor makes it easier for him to take the next step, The one he's been turning over and over in his mind since the first night he set his bag down by their table. "There's something I've been carrying," he says, "and I don't want to throw it at you like one more burden. I know you've had enough of those already. Being the daughter of a single mom, then a single girl keeping everything together on your own, and now sharing a roof with a man who arrived with more questions than answers." She looks at him, really looks, and that steady attention gives him courage. "You're not just questions," she says quietly. "You are also the one who chases runaway potatoes on the stairs and fixes drains and reads tiny print for old neighbors. But go ahead. Tell me what's in your pocket." He takes a breath, watching it plume in the chilly air. "I don't know when it started," he says slowly. "Maybe the day you insisted I sit and eat while you finished the dishes. Or the night you wrote those simple promises on kitchen paper, so I wouldn't wake up in the dark thinking about rent. Or the way you explained the clinic forms to Ms. Hua as if it was the most natural thing to give away that kind of patience. But somewhere between you can sleep in the storage room and you belong to this table now." My heart started leaning. Not in a rush, not to hide from the pain of "not my son," but because here, with you and Nai, I've seen little pieces of the life I didn't know I was allowed to want. Spilled tea, shared spoons, a key on a hook that isn't tied to anyone's power but ours. His voice catches, and he pauses, afraid of saying too much, too clumsily. "I used to think love had to be impressive," he goes on. "Big gestures, big dinners, big sacrifices, like in the movies or in my father's stories when he was trying to polish our family image. But now I find myself thinking about things like who changes the stairway bulb and who remembers to defrost the meat, and who knows without asking that the day was heavy. When I see you stir soup, straighten papers, tuck Nai in, and leave the door just a little open, it feels like watching someone write the definition of love in very small handwriting, over and over." Diep listens, her hands crossed in front of her, fingers tucked into her sleeves for warmth. The scene might remind some of you of talks you had in borrowed coats on chilly porches, where the world seemed to pause to hear whether two people would dare to say what was in their hearts. "James," she says gently, "you've come to us with a heart bruised in a very specific way. That 'not my son,' it doesn't just disappear. It can make you reach for the nearest warm place and call it forever, even if you're not sure yet what you're promising. I need to know, is this about me, or about not wanting to be alone on the other side of that sentence?" It's a fair question, the kind that shows she's not interested in being anyone's bandage. "It's about both," he says honestly, and then corrects himself. "It started as, I can't breathe alone with this. Yes, but it's grown into something else. When I sweep the floor after dinner and hear you humming, I don't feel like a guest anymore. I feel like I want to protect that sound. When I saw my name written under emergency jark contact, next to yours instead of feeling trapped, I felt trusted. I want to be worthy of that, not just grateful for the spare room." He hesitates, then adds, "I think what I'm trying to ask is, do you think it's possible someday, not now, not tomorrow, but someday, for us to build a life together that isn't held together by crisis, but by choice? A life where we plan things like who goes to the parent meeting and who stays home stirring the soup, and where I'm not just the man who moved in after his father hurt him, but your partner in whatever niche we make. Whether that's helping neighbors with papers and tea, or something else this table dreams up." The words hang between them, gentle but powerful, like one more light on their short string. I don't want to rush your pain away, he adds, speaking faster now because his courage feels thin. I know you've lived as a single girl who had to be strong for herself and for Nye, and I respect that. If my feelings make your load heavier right now, if they come at the wrong time, you can say so. I can keep washing dishes and hanging laundry and sleeping in the little room as long as you need. This is not an ultimatum. It's just truth that started to feel too big to carry quietly. For a moment, she doesn't answer. She looks up at their window, where the faint glow of the knoll lights paints a small halo around the paper star, and you can almost hear the thoughts moving behind her eyes. Memories of her single mom waking in the dark to worry over bills, of times she tried to lean on the wrong shoulders and found them unreliable, of how precious this new balance with James and Nye is, and how risky it might feel to shift it. You know, she says finally, voice soft but clear. My mother used to warn me about men who appear right after a storm. They may just want shelter, she'd say. Wait until the sun comes back and see if they're still there. She looks at him, the corner of her mouth twitching with a faint, almost apologetic smile. You arrived in the middle of a storm, James. A big one. In your family, in your heart, even in our small apartment, with the surgery and the money and the papers. I have watched you fix pipes, chase potatoes, kneel to tie Nie's shoes, read letters for old neighbors. I've seen you listening more than talking. Those are good signs. But I also know the sun has not fully come back yet. You're still learning who you are without that man's name on your shoulders. He nods, accepting that without flinching. Her honesty doesn't sting. It feels like the same kind of careful truth she writes on their simple papers. So what do we do with this? He asks quietly. With what I feel? She takes a step closer, close enough that he can see the tiny flecks of flour still on her sleeve from baking earlier. We don't ignore it, she says. We don't throw it away. We also don't turn it into a wedding by next week. The word wedding makes his heart skip, but she says it almost playfully, like she knows he's already imagining a future and wants to keep both their feet on the ground. Tonight, she continues, we walk back to our little kitchen. We help Nye finish placing her cards. We sleep, and tomorrow we have breakfast, the kind where no one rushes. We sit at the table with tea and maybe porridge if we have enough rice, and we talk in the daylight about what this might look like, how we'd share decisions, how we'd protect Nie's heart, how we'd keep space for both your healing and mine. I don't want to answer in the dark, when everything feels bigger and softer. Give me one night to think with my whole self, daughter of a single mom, single girl who learned to survive, and woman who has started to hope again. Then ask me again over toast. It's not a yes, not yet, but it's also not a no. And for anyone who has lived long enough to know that rushed promises can hurt more than honest hesitation, her answer might feel like the most loving thing she could offer. He lets out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. I can do that, he says. I can wait for morning. I can slice the toast. She laughs, the sound easing the last of the tension. Then let that be our plan, she says. Tonight we carry your truth home and put it on the table next to the folder and the Knoll box. Tomorrow, we see how it looks in daylight. As they climb the stairs together, side by side, there is a new kind of quiet between them. Not the silence of unspoken fear, but the hush of a seed just planted, not yet sprouted, sitting under the soil of shared routine and mutual respect. When they step back into the apartment, Nye looks up from her careful arrangement of cards. Did you see the star? She asks. We saw it, Diep answers. And tomorrow, your Uncle James is going to help me make a very important breakfast." The little girl nods, satisfied with an answer that sounds both ordinary and special. Later, when the lights are off and only the star and the faint hallway glow remain, both adults lie awake for a little while in their separate rooms, hearts full but calm, thinking of tea, porridge, maybe an extra slice of fruit, and a conversation that will not be easy but will be honest. He sits up, touches the little notebook under his pillow like a talisman, and tells himself that this talk is not a test to pass or fail, but an extension of the simple truths they've been writing on scrap paper and tucking into folders. What do we have? What do we need? What can we share? When he opens his door, the apartment already smells like toasted rice and a hint of ginger, and the Noel lights are off, leaving the room lit only by the pale morning coming through the window and reflecting off the paper star. It's quieter than usual, almost like the home itself is holding its breath. Diep stands at the stove in an old sweater, stirring rice porridge in a dented pot with the same careful attention she once used to sign clinic forms. On the table, 3 bowls are set, but one of the chairs has a small stack of paper and crayons on it instead of a cushion. "Good morning," she says, and her voice is calm, not overly bright, which somehow steadies him more than any forced cheerfulness would. "You're just in time. The porridge decided to be cooperative today. Some days it sulks and sticks." He manages a smile and glances at the chair with the papers. "What's that?" he asks, and Nai, already in her school sweater, appears from behind him like a tiny magician. "That's my mission," she announces. "Ms. Diep says you two need big people talking time, so I'm going to make place cards for the onions and the neighbors. I have to draw them each a chair at an imaginary table." She says it with enormous importance, and you can almost hear grandmothers around the world nodding at the wisdom of giving a child a task that makes them feel included while adults talk. "You'll sit at the windowsill," Diep explains to James, "guarding the garden." Nai nods solemnly and picks up her crayons. "I'll be right there," she says, pointing to the sill where the jars of green onions are lined up like shy guests. "If you need more tea or help deciding who sits next to whom, just call me." That small assurance that she's nearby, not banished, lets the atmosphere stay gentle. Once Ni has settled with her papers at the window, humming to herself, Diep ladles porridge into the 2 bowls left in the middle of the table, sets out a small dish of salt and a few slices of leftover apple to share, and sits down opposite James. For a heartbeat, they both just hold their spoons, feeling the difference between all the other breakfasts and this one. The ordinary clink of ceramic has a little echo of ceremony in it. "So," she says softly, "here we are. Morning as promised. No candlelight to make us sentimental. Just porridge and that star watching us from the window." He exhales, grateful that she went first, that she acknowledged the strangeness without making it heavy. "In some ways," he says, "this feels bigger than anything I did in my father's boardrooms. There, I always knew the script. Here, it's just us." He looks her in the eye. "Thank you for asking me to wait until daylight. It made me listen to myself a bit more, instead of just my panic." She stirs her porridge, letting the spoon circle slowly. "I needed the time too," she admits, "to talk to my mother a little in my head, to remember what I promised myself as a single girl when I was carrying Nai alone, and to notice how my heart feels when your shoes are by the door at night and when they're not." She gives a faint, wry smile. "It's easier to be wise about other people's love lives than your own, you know. Anyone who's ever given advice more easily than taken it would likely smile at that too." "Last night," she continues, Part of me, the old scared part, wanted to say, "No, don't change anything. Don't name this. Just keep it vague and temporary so it can't hurt you as much if it breaks." But another part of me, the one who wrote "You're not a guest" on kitchen paper, the one who watched you carry groceries without keeping score, kept thinking, if we never speak about what's growing here, we might end up hurting each other anyway. Confusion can bruise a heart just as much as rejection. He nods, feeling both seen and gently challenged. "I don't want you confused," he says. "If anything, I want you freer, to say yes, to say no, to change your mind if this stops feeling like home." The words cost him something, but he means them. Now, our lives have been steered by men who thought their decisions were laws, she replies, tipping her head slightly. Your father with his, "not my son," my brother with his opinions about who I should or shouldn't love, even my own father before he left. If we're going to build anything new, it has to be under a different rule. No one is trapped. She lets that settle, then sets her spoon down and folds her hands together. Not in prayer exactly, but in a gesture of intention. "So here is what I can say this morning, with my eyes open," she begins. "I do care for you, James. Not just as a housemate or a wounded bird I'm helping. I care when you're late coming home from the clinic. I care how tired your shoulders look when you forget to roll them back. I care in a way that makes me imagine more. I think about what color shirt you'll wear when you take Nye to a school meeting for the first time. I think about which recipes of my mother's I want us to try together, as if you'll still be sitting at that same spot for many winters." She smiles, a little shy, and he feels warmth spread through him like the porridge in his belly. "But," she adds, and the word is soft but firm, "I also carry responsibilities that don't bend easily. I am a mother first. I've survived disappointments by not wrapping my whole identity around any man. I need us to move in a way that protects Nye's sense of safety and my own ability to stand if, for any reason, you find one day that this isn't the life you truly want." The tension between hope and caution is clear, but it isn't harsh. It's the careful balancing act many women know all too well. "What would moving carefully look like to you?" he asks, grateful she's spelling it out instead of expecting him to guess. "For now," she says, "it would mean we don't suddenly announce to the world, we are a couple, and change everything overnight. It would mean we name this as a direction we're walking in, not a finish line we've crossed. We continue to share chores, meals, decisions about Nye, like we have been, but with a bit more honesty about the fact that our hearts are involved. We talk about how we'd handle it if you found work in another neighborhood, or if my sister decided to move in for a while, or if your mother needed more care. We make practical as well as romantic plans." She taps the table lightly. "And when the time feels right, we can write some of those plans down. Not like cold contracts, but like we did with the room rent notes. Clear, simple, full of kindness." He actually laughs, the sound bubbling up unexpectedly. "Leave it to us to turn a love story into paperwork at the kitchen table," he says. "But in a good way," she counters. "My mother always said, if it's not clear on paper, it may not be clear in the heart. We're creating our own niche here, a way of loving that includes grocery lists and gas notices and who walks the child to school. That deserves ink." He sobers again and reaches across the table, not grabbing, just extending his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. "Then let me say this, as clearly as I can," he offers. "I choose you, Diep. I choose this table, this key on the hook, these onions in jars, these neighbors who knock with questions. not as a consolation prize because I lost my father's house, but as the life I want to build now that I see what truly matters. I know I'm still healing, and I know you have your scars too. That's why I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking, can we walk forward as if that might be where we're headed one day? Can we start planning as partners, even if we don't wear any new rings yet? His voice is steady now, because he's not making a grand speech to impress anyone. He's simply aligning his words with the way he's been living. Washing dishes, reading tiny print, hanging short strings of lights. She looks down at his hand, then places her own in it, fingers warm and sure. Yes, she says, and the word is small but profound. Yes, we can walk in that direction. We can let our everyday choices be practice for a bigger promise. We can be each other's person in the ways that matter most, sharing burdens, sharing laughter, sharing keys and calendars, while we watch how our hearts and our lives respond over time. A breath she didn't know she'd been holding escapes in a tiny laugh. And if one day it feels right, we can call my sister and ask her to bring my mother's old bracelet and bake something fancy and let the neighbors pin red yarn across the hallway. But until then, we can let the star and the light string be our secret engagement, an understanding that we're no longer just three people sharing space, but a family trying to grow into itself. You can almost feel how that would land for anyone who's learned to value slow, steady commitments over whirlwind romance. In the next room, Nai finishes her onion place cards and trots over, sensing something has shifted. She pauses at the doorway, eyes flicking from their joined hands to their soft faces. "Did you decide the important breakfast thing?" she asks. Diep squeezes James's fingers once before letting go. "We did," she says. "We decided your Uncle James is going to stay on our team for a long time, if that's okay with you." The little girl's face lights up. "Then I have to make a bigger heart," she declares. "The one on my wall only has 3 people, but teams can grow." She runs back to her room, already planning, and the adults share a look that says more than any formal announcement could. The rest of the day unfolds in the same small, meaningful rhythms as before. Laundry on the line, soup simmering, a neighbor knocking with a question about a letter from her son. And yet everything feels just a bit more anchored, as if the foundation under their routines has thickened. When the bank envelope comes tomorrow, or the clinic calls with a rescheduled appointment, they will sit at the table and face it together, not as a single girl doing her best and a guest grateful for shelter, but as 2 adults who have quietly, deliberately chosen to build something enduring in a modest apartment with a paper star in the window. And somewhere, just beyond the end of this day, you can sense a new arc beginning. Perhaps James will start sketching out a small service on another sheet of kitchen paper. Papers and tea, help with forms and calls, with Diep's name under founder and his under assistant. Or maybe they'll start saving a few coins in a jar labeled future rings and repairs, laughing at the combination, but meaning both. For now, though, it is enough that the next time he hangs the key on the hook, he does it knowing it's not just the key to a room, but to a life they are slowly, carefully, and very much on purpose deciding to share.